Birds by Bruno Schulz. Came the yellow days of winter, filled with boredom. The rust-colored earth was covered with a threadbare, meager tablecloth of snow full of holes. There was not enough of it for some of the roofs, and so they stood there, black and brown, shingle and thatch, arcs containing the sooty expanses of attics, coal-black cathedrals, bristling with ribs of rafters, beams, and spars, the dark lungs of winter winds. Each dawn revealed new chimney stacks and chimney pots, which had emerged during the hours of darkness, blown up by the night winds, the black pipes of a devil's organ. The chimney sweeps could not get rid of the crows, which in the evening covered the branches of the trees around the church with living black leaves, then took off, fluttering, and came back, each clinging to its own place on its own branch, only to fly away at dawn in large flocks, like gusts of soot, flakes of dirt, undulating and fantastic, blackening with their insistent cawing and musty yellow streaks of light. The days hardened with cold and boredom, like last year's loaves of bread. One began to cut them with blunt knives, without appetite, with a lazy indifference. Father had stopped going out. He banked up the stoves, studied the ever-elusive essence of fire, experienced the salty, metallic taste and the smoky smell of wintry salamanders that licked the shiny soot in the throat of the chimney. He applied himself lovingly at that time to all manner of small repairs in the upper regions of the rooms. At all hours of the day, one could see him crouched on top of a ladder, working at something under the ceiling, at the cornices over the tall windows, at the counterweights and chains of the hanging lamps. Following the custom of house painters, he used a pair of steps as enormous stilts, and he felt perfectly happy in that bird's-eye perspective close to the sky, leaves and birds painted on the ceiling. He grew more and more remote from practical affairs. When my mother, worried and unhappy about his condition, tried to draw him into a conversation about business, about the payments due at the end of the month, he listened to her absent-mindedly, anxiety showing in his abstracted look. Sometimes he stopped her with a warning gesture of the hand in order to run to a corner of the room, put his ear to a crack in the floor, and, by lifting the index fingers of both hands, emphasize the gravity of the investigation, which began to listen intently. At that time, we did not yet understand the sad origin of these eccentricities, the deplorable complex which had been maturing in him. Mother had no influence over him, but he gave a lot of respectful attention to Adela. The cleaning of his room was to him a great and important ceremony, of which he always arranged to be a witness, watching all Adela's movements with a mixture of apprehension and pleasurable excitement. He ascribed to all her functions a deeper symbolic meaning. When, with young, firm gestures, the girl pushed a long-handled broom across the floor, Father could hardly bear it. Tears would scream from his eyes, silent laughter transformed his face, and his body was shaken by spasms of delight. He was ticklish to the point of madness. It was enough for Adela to waggle her fingers at him, to imitate tickling, for him to rush through all the rooms in a wild panic, banging the doors after him, to fall at last on the bed in the farthest room and wriggle in convulsions of laughter, imagining the tickling which he found irresistible. Because of this, Adela's power over Father was almost limitless. At that time, we noticed for the first time Father's passionate interest in animals. To begin with, it was the passion of the huntsman and the artist rolled into one. It was also perhaps a deeper, biological sympathy of one creature for kindred, yet different forms of life, a kind of experimenting in the unexplored regions of existence. Only at a later stage did matters take that uncanny, complicated, essentially sinful and unnatural turn, which it is better not to bring to the light of day. But it all began with the hatching out of birds' eggs. With a great outlay of effort and money, Father imported from Hamburg or Holland or from zoological stations in Africa birds' eggs on which he set enormous brood hens from Belgium. It was a process which fascinated me as well, this hatching out of the chicks, which were real anomalies of shape and color. It was difficult to anticipate, in these monsters with enormous, fantastic beaks, which they opened wide immediately after birth, hissing greedily to show the backs of their throats, in these lizards with frail, naked bodies of hunchbacks, the future peacocks, peasants, grouse, or condors. Placed in cotton wool, in baskets, this dragon brood lifted blind, wall-eyed heads on thin necks, croaking voicelessly from their dumb throats. My father would walk along the shelves, dressed in a green baize apron, like a gardener in a hothouse of cacti, and conjure up from nothingness these blind bubbles, pulsating with life, these impotent bellies receiving the outside world only in the form of food, these growths on the surface of life, climbing blindfolded towards the light. A few weeks later, when these blind buds of matter burst open, the rooms were filled with the bright chatter and scintillating chirruping of their new inhabitants. The birds perched on the curtained pelmets on the tops of wardrobes. They nestled in the tangle of tin branches and the metal scrolls of the hanging lamps. While Father pored over his large ornithological textbooks and studied the colored plates, these feathery phantasms seemed to rise from the pages and fill the room with colors, with splashes of crimson, strips of sapphire, verdigris, and silver. At feeding time they formed a motley, undulating bed on the floor, a living carpet, which at the intrusion of a stranger would fall apart, scatter into fragments, flutter in the air, and finally settle high under the ceilings. I remember in particular a certain condor, an enormous bird with a featherless neck, its face wrinkled and knobbly. It was an emaciated ascetic, a Buddhist lama, full of imperturbable dignity in its behavior, guided by the rigid ceremonial of its great species. When it sat facing my father, motionless in the monumental position of ageless Egyptian idols, its eyes covered with a whitish cataract, which it pulled down sideways over its pupil, to shut itself up completely in the contemplation of its dignified solitude. It seemed, with its stony profile, like an older brother of my father's. Its body and muscles seemed to be made of the same material. It had the same hard, wrinkled skin, the same desiccated, bony face, the same horny, deep eye sockets. Even the hands, strong in the joints, my father's long, thick hands with their rounded nails, had their counterpart in the condor's claws. I could not resist the impression, when looking at the sleeping condor, that I was in the presence of a mummy, a dried-out, shrunken mummy of my father. I believe that even my mother noticed this strange resemblance, although we never discussed the subject. It is significant that the condor used my father's chamber pot. Not content with the hatching out of more and more new specimens, my father arranged the marriages of birds in the attic. He sent out matchmakers. He tied up eager, attractive birds in the holes and crannies under the roof. And soon the roof of our house, an enormous double-rigged shingle roof, became a real bird's hostel, a Noah's Ark, to which all kinds of feathery creatures flew from far afield. Long after the liquidation of the bird's paradise, this tradition persisted in the avian world, and during the period of spring migration our roof was besieged by whole flocks of cranes, pelicans, peacocks, and sundry other birds. However, after a short period of splendor, the whole undertaking took a sorry turn. It soon became necessary to move my father to 2 rooms at the top of the house, which had served as storage rooms. We could hear from there, at dawn, the mixed clangor of birds' voices. The wooden walls of the attic rooms, helped by the resonance of the empty space under the gables, sounded with the roar, the flutterings, the crowing, the gurgling, the mating cries. For a few weeks, father was lost to view. He only rarely came down to the apartment, and when he did, we noticed that he seemed to have shrunk, to become smaller and thinner. Occasionally, forgetting himself, he would rise from his chair at table, wave his arms as if they were wings, and emit a long drawn-out bird's call while his eyes misted over. Then, rather embarrassed, he would join us in laughing it off and try to turn the whole incident into a joke. One day, during spring cleaning, Adela suddenly appeared in father's bird kingdom. Stopping in the doorway, she wrung her hands at the fetid smell that filled the room, the heaps of droppings covering the floor, the tables, and the chairs. Without hesitation, she flung open the window, and, with the help of a long broom, she prodded the whole mass of birds into life. A fiendish cloud of feathers and wings arose screaming, and Adela, like a furious Maenad protected by the whirlwind of her thyrsus, danced the dance of destruction. My father, waving his arms in panic, tried to lift himself into the air with his feathered flock. Slowly the winged cloud thinned until at last Adela remained on the battlefield, exhausted and out of breath, along with my father, who now, adopting a worried hangdog expression, was ready to accept complete defeat. A moment later, my father came downstairs, a broken man, an exiled king who had lost his throne and his kingdom. The Night of the Great Season by Bruno Schulz. Everyone knows that in a run of normal uneventful years, that great eccentric time begets sometimes other years, different, prodigal years, which, like a sixth smallest toe, grow a 13th freak month. We use the word freak deliberately because the 13th month only rarely reaches maturity, and like a child conceived late in its mother's life, it lags behind in growth. It is a hunchback month, a half-witted shoot, more tentative than real. What is at fault is the senile intemperance of the summer, its lustful and belated spurt of vitality. It sometimes happens that August has passed, and yet the old thick trunk of summer continues by force of habit to produce, and from its mouldered wood grows those crab-like weed days, sterile and stupid, added as an afterthought, stunted, empty, useless days, white days, permanently astonished and quite unnecessary. They sprout, irregular and uneven, formless and joined like the fingers of a monster's hand, stumps folded into a fist. There are people who liken these days to an apocrypha, put secretly between the chambers of the great book of the year, to palimpsests covertly included between its pages, to those white, unprinted sheets on which eyes, replete with reading and the remembered shapes of words, can imagine colors and pictures which gradually become paler and paler from the blankness of the pages, or can rest on their neutrality before continuing the quest for new adventures in new chapters. Ah, that old yellowed romance of the year, that large crumbling book of the calendar, it lies forgotten somewhere in the archives of time, and its content continues to increase between the boards, swelling incessantly from the garrulity of mouths, from the quick self-perpetuation of lies, of drivel, and of dreams which multiply in it. Ah, when writing down these tales, revising the stories about my father on the used margins of its text, don't I, too, surrender to the secret hope that they will merge imperceptibly with the yellowing pages of that most splendid, mouldering book, that they will sink into the gentle rustle of its pages and become absorbed there? The events I am now going to relate happened in that 13th supernumerary freak month of that year, on those blank pages of the great chronicles of the calendar. The mornings were strangely refreshing and tart, from the quietened and cooler flow of time, from the completely new smell in the air, from the different consistency of the light. One could recognize that one had entered a new series of days, a new era of the Lord's year. Voices trembled under these new skies resonantly and lightly, as in a new and still empty house which smells of varnish and paint, of things begun and not yet used. With a strange emotion, one tried out new echoes, one bit into them with curiosity, as, on a cool and sober morning on the eve of a journey, one bites into a fresh, still warm currant loaf. My father was again sitting at the back of his shop, in a small, low room divided like a beehive into many cells of file boxes, from which endless layers of paper, letters and invoices overflowed. From the rustle of sheets, From the ceaseless turning over of pages arose the squared, empty existence of that room, the constant moving of files of innumerable letters with business headings created in the stuffy air on apotheosis, a bird's-eye mirage of an industrial city, bristling with smoky chimneys, surrounded by a row of medals, and with a clasp formed from the curves and flourishes of a proud "and Co." There my father would sit, as if in an aviary, on a high stool, and the lofts of filing cabinets rustled with piles of paper, and all the pigeonholes filled with the twitter of figures. The depth of the large shop became, from day to day, darker and richer, with stocks of cloth, serge, velvet, and cord. On the somber shelves, those granaries and silos, the cool, felted fabrics matured and yielded interest. The powerful capital of autumn multiplied and mellowed. It grew and ripened and spread, ever wider, until the shelves resembled the rows of some great amphitheater. It was augmented daily by new loads of goods, brought in crates and bales in the cool of the morning on the broad, bear-like shoulders of groaning, bearded porters who exuded an aura of autumn freshness mixed with vodka. The shop assistants unpacked these new supplies and filled with their rich drapery colors, as with putty, all the holes and cracks of the tall cupboards. They ran the gamut of all the autumn shades and went up and down through the octaves of color. Beginning at the bottom, they tried shyly and plaintively the contralto semitones, passed on to the washed-out grays of distance, to tapestry blues, and, going upward in ever broader chords, reached deep royal blues, the indigo of distant forests, and the plush of rustling parks, in order to enter, through the ochres, reds, tans, and sepias, the whispering shadows of wilted gardens, and to reach finally the dark smell of fungi, the waft of mold in the depth of autumn nights, and the dull accompaniment of the darkest basses. My father walked along these arsenals of autumn goods, and calmed and soothed the rising force of these masses of cloth, the power of the season. He wanted to keep intact for as long as possible those reserves of stored color. He was afraid to break into that iron fund of autumn, to change it into cash. Yet at the same time he knew and felt that soon an autumn wind would come, a devastating wind which would blow through the cupboards, that they would give way, that nothing would check the flood, and that the streams of color would engulf the whole city. The time of the great season was approaching. The streets were getting busy. At 6 in the evening the city became feverish. The houses stood flushed, and the people walked about, made up in bright colors, illuminated by some interior fire, their eyes shining with a festive fever, beautiful, yet evil. In the side streets, in quiet backwaters fleeing into the night, the city was empty. Only children were out under the balconies of the small squares, playing breathlessly, noisily, and nonsensically. They put small balloons to their lips and filled them with air in order to transform themselves into red and crowing cockerels, colored autumnal masks, fantastic and absurd. It seemed that thus swollen and crowing, they would begin to float in the air in long-colored chains and fly over the city like migrating birds, fantastic flotillas of tissue paper and autumn weather. Or else they pushed one another on small, clattering carts, which played tunes with their little rattling wheels, axles, and shafts. Filled with their happy cries, the carts rolled down the street to the broadly spreading, evening yellow river, where they disintegrated into a jumble of discs, pegs, and sticks. And while the children's games became increasingly noisier and more complicated, while the city's flushes darkened into purple, the whole world suddenly began to wilt and blacken, and extrude an uncertain dusk which contaminated everything. Treacherous and poisonous, the plague of dusk spread, passed from one object to another, and everything it touched became black and rotten and scattered into dust. People fled before it in silent panic, but the disease always caught up with them and spread in a dark rash on their foreheads. Their faces disappeared under large, shapeless spots. They continued on their way, now featureless, without eyes, shedding, as they walked, one mask after another, so that the dusk became filled with the discarded larvae dropped in their flight. Then a black, rotting bark began to cover everything in large putrid scabs of darkness, and while down below everything disintegrated and changed into nothingness in that silent panic of quick dissolution, above there grew and endured the alarum of sunset, vibrating with the tinkling of a million tiny bells set in motion by the rise of a million unseen larks flying together into the enormous silvery infinite. Then, suddenly, night came. A vast night, growing vaster from the pressure of gusts of wind. In its multiple labyrinths, nests of brightness were hewn, the shops, large colored lanterns, filled with goods and the bustle of customers. Through the bright glass of these lanterns, the noisy and strangely ceremonial rites of autumn shopping could be observed. The great, undulating autumn night, with the shadows rising in it and the winds broadening it, hid in its folds pockets of brightness, the motley wares of street traders, chocolates, biscuits, exotic sweets, their kiosks and barrows, made from empty boxes, papered with advertisements, full of soap, of gay trash, of gilded nothings, of tinfoil, trumpets, wafers, and colored mints, were stations of light-heartedness, outposts of gaiety, scattered on the hangings of the enormous, labyrinthine, wind-shaken night. The dense crowd sailed in darkness, in loud confusion, with the shuffle of 1,000 feet, in the chatter of 1,000 mouths, a disorderly, entangled migration proceeding along the arteries of the autumnal city. Thus flowed that river, full of noise, of dark looks, of sly winks, intersected by conversations, chopped up by laughter, an enormous babble of gossip, tumult, and chatter. It seemed as if a mob of dry poppy heads, scattering their seeds, rattleheads, was on the march. My father, his cheeks flushed, his eyes shining, walked up and down his festively lit shop, excited, listening intently. Through the glass panes of the shop window and of the door, the distant hubbub of the city, the drone of wandering crowds could be heard. Above the stillness of the shop, an oil lamp hung from the high ceiling, expelling the shadows from all the remote nooks and crannies. The empty floor cracked in the silence and added up in the light, crosswise and lengthwise, its shining parquet squares. The large tiles of this chessboard talked to each other in tiny dry crackles, and answered here and there with a louder knock. The pieces of cloth lay quiet and still in their felty fluffiness, and exchanged looks along the walls behind my father's back, passing silent signs of agreement from cupboard to cupboard. Father was listening. In the silence of the night, his ear seemed to grow larger and to reach out beyond the window, a fantastic coral, a red polypus watching the chaos of the night. He listened and heard with growing anxiety the distant tide of the approaching crowds. Fearfully, he looked around the empty shop, searching for his assistants. Unfortunately, those dark and red-haired administering angels had flown away somewhere. Father was alone, terrified of the crowd which was soon to flood the calm of the shop in a plundering, noisy mob, to divide among themselves and put up to auction the whole rich autumn which he had collected over the years and stored in his large, secluded silo. Where were the shop assistants? Where were those handsome cherubs who had been entrusted with the defense of the dark bastions of cloth? My father thought with painful suspicion that perhaps they were somewhere in the depths of the building with other men's daughters. Standing immobile and anxious, his eyes shining in the lamplit silence of the shop, he heard with his inner ear what was happening inside the house, in the back chambers of that large colored lantern. That house opened before him, room after room, chamber after chamber, like a house of cards, and he saw the shop assistants chasing Adela through all the empty, brightly lit rooms, upstairs and downstairs, until she escaped them and reached the kitchen to barricade herself there behind the kitchen dresser. There, Adela stood, panting, amused, smiling to herself, her long lashes fluttering. The shop assistants were giggling, crouched behind the door. The kitchen window was open onto the black night, saturated with dreams and complications. The dark, half-opened panes shone with the reflections of a distant illumination. The gleaming saucepans and jars stood immobile on all sides and glinted with their thick glaze. Adela leaned cautiously from the window, her brightly made-up face with the fluttering eyes. She looked for the shop assistants in the dark courtyard, sensing an ambush. and then she saw them, advancing slowly and carefully toward her in single file, along the narrow ledge under the window which ran the length of the wall, now red from the glare of distant lights. My father shouted in anger and desperation, but at that very moment the hubbub of voices drew much nearer, and the shop window became peopled with faces crooked with laughter, with chattering mouths, with noses flattened on the shining panes. My father grew purple with anger and jumped on the counter, and while the crowd stormed his fortress and entered his shop in a noisy mess, father, in one leap, reached the shelves of fabrics, and, hanging high above the crowd, began to blow with all his strength a large shofar, sounding the alert. But the ceiling did not resound with the rustle of angels' wings speeding to his rescue. Instead, each plaint of the shofar was answered by the loud, sneering choir of the crowd. "Jacob! Start trading! Jacob, start selling!" they called, and the chant, repeated over and over again, became rhythmical, transforming itself into the melody of a chorus sung by them all. My father saw that resistance would be useless, jumped down from his ledge, and moved with a shout toward the barricades of cloth. Grown tall with fury, his head swollen into a purple fist, he rushed like a fighting prophet on the ramparts of cloth, and began to storm against them. He leaned with his whole strength against the enormous bales, heaving them from their places. He put his shoulders under the great lengths of cloth, and made them fall on the counter with a dull thud. The bales overturned, unfolding in the air like enormous flags. The shelves exploded with bursts of draperies, with waterfalls of fabric, as if touched by the wand of Moses. The reserves from the cupboard poured out and flowed in a broad, relentless stream. The colorful contents of the shelves spread and multiplied, covering all the counters and tables. The walls of the shop disappeared under the powerful formations of that cosmogony of cloth, under its mountain ranges that rose in imposing massifs. Wide valleys opened up between the slopes, and lines of continents loomed up from the pathos of broad plains. The interior of the shop formed itself into the panorama of an autumn landscape full of lakes and distance. Against that backdrop, my father wandered among the folds and valleys of a fantastic Canaan. He strode about, his hands spread out prophetically to touch the clouds, and shaped the land with strokes of inspiration. And down below, at the bottom of that Sinai which rose from my father's anger, stood the gesticulating crowd, cursing, worshipping Baal, and bargaining. They dipped their hands into the soft folds of fabric, they draped themselves into colored cloth, they wrapped improvised cloaks around themselves, and talked incoherently and without cease. My father would suddenly appear over a group of customers, increased in stature by his anger, to thunder against the idolaters with great and powerful words. Then, driven to despair, he would climb again on the high galleries of the cupboards, and run crazily along the ledges and shelves, on the resounding boards of the bare scaffolding, pursued by visions of the shameless lust which he felt was being given full rein behind his back. The shop assistants had just reached the iron balcony, level with the window, and, clinging to the railings, they grabbed Adela by the waist and pulled her away from the window. She still fluttered her eyelids, and dragged her slim, silk-stockinged legs behind her. When my father, horrified by the hideousness of sin, merged his angry gestures with the awe-inspiring landscape, the carefree worshippers of Baal below him gave themselves up to unbridled mirth. An epidemic of laughter took hold of that mob. How could one expect seriousness from that race of rattles and nutcrackers? How could one demand understanding from my father's stupendous worries from these windmills, incessantly grinding words to a colored pulp? Deaf to the thunder of father's prophetic wrath, those traders in silk kaftans crouched in small groups around the piles of folded material, gaily discussing, amid bursts of laughter, the qualities of the goods. These black-clad merchants with their rapid tongues obscured the noble essence of the landscape, diminished it by the hash of words, almost engulfed it. In other places, in front of the waterfalls of light fabrics, stood groups of Jews in colored gabardines and tall fur hats. These were the gentlemen of the great congregation, distinguished and solemn men, stroking their long, well-groomed beards and holding sober and diplomatic discourse. But even in those ceremonial conversations, in the looks which they exchanged, glimmers of smiling irony could be detected. Around these groups milled the common crowd, a shapeless mob without face or individuality. It somehow filled the gaps in the landscape. It littered the background with the bells and rattles of its thoughtless chatter. These were the jesters, the dancing crowd of harlequins and pulcinellas, who, without any serious business intentions themselves, made by their clownish tricks a mockery of the negotiations starting here and there. Gradually, however, tired of jokes, this merry mob scattered to the farthest points of the landscape, and there slowly lost itself among the rocky crags and valleys. Probably one by one, these jesters sank into the cracks and folds of the terrain, like children tired of playing who disappear during a party into the corners and back rooms of the festive house. Meanwhile, the fathers of the city, members of the great Sanhedrin, walked up and down in dignified and serious groups and led earnest discussion in undertones. Having spread themselves over the whole extensive mountain country, they wandered in twos and threes on distant and circuitous roads. Their short, dark silhouettes peopled the desert plateau over which hung a dark and heavy sky, full of clouds, cut into long parallel furrows, into silvery white streaks, showing in its depth ever more distant strata of air. The lamplight created an artificial day in that region, a strange day, a day without dawn or dusk. My father slowly quietened down. His anger composed itself and cooled under the calming influence of the landscape. He was now sitting in a gallery of high shelves and looking at the vast autumnal country. He saw people fishing in distant lakes. In their tiny shell-like boats, fishermen, two to a boat, dipped their nets in the water. On the bank, boys were carrying on their heads baskets full of flapping silvery catches. And then he noticed that groups of wanderers in the distance were lifting their faces to the sky, pointing to something with upraised hands. And soon the sky came out in a colored rash, in blotches which grew and spread, and was filled with a strange tribe of birds, circling and revolving in great crisscrossing spirals. Their lofty flight, the movement of their wings, formed majestic scrolls that filled the silent sky. Some of them, enormous storks, floated almost immobile on calmly spread wings. Others, resembling colored plumes or barbarous trophies, had to flap their wings heavily and clumsily to maintain height upon the current of warm air. Still others, formless conglomerations of wings, of powerful legs and bare necks, were like badly stuffed vultures and condors from which the sawdust was spilling. There were among them two-headed birds, and birds with many wings. There were cripples, too, limping through the air in one-winged, awkward flight. The sky now resembled those in old murals, full of monsters and fantastic beasts, which circled around, passing and eluding each other in elliptical maneuvers. My father rose on his porch and, in a sudden glare of light, stretched out his hands, summoning the birds with an old incantation. He recognized them with deep emotion. They were the distant, forgotten progeny of that generation of birds which at one time Adela had chased away to all 4 points of the sky. That brood of freaks, that malformed, wasted tribe of birds, was now returning, degenerated or overgrown. Nonsensically large, stupidly developed, the birds were empty and lifeless inside. All their vitality went into their plumage, into external adornment. They were like exhibits of extinct species in a museum, the lumber room of a bird's paradise. Some of them were flying on their backs, had heavy misshapen beaks like padlocks, were blind, or were covered with curiously colored lumps. How moved my father was by this unexpected return, how he marveled at the instinct of these birds, at their attachment to the master, whom that expelled tribe had preserved in their soul like a legend, in order to return to their ancient motherland after numerous generations, on the last day before the extinction of the tribe. But these blind birds made of paper could not recognize my father. In vain did he call them with the old formulas in the forgotten language of the birds. They did not hear him nor see him. All of a sudden, stones began to whistle through the air. The merrymakers, the stupid, thoughtless people had begun to throw them into the fantastic bird-filled sky. In vain did father warn them. In vain did he entreat them with magical gestures. He was not heard nor heeded. The birds began to fall. Hit by stones, they hung heavily and waited while still in the air. Even before they crashed to the ground, they were a formless heap of feathers. In a moment, the plateau was strewn with strange, fantastic carrion. Before my father could reach the place of slaughter, the once splendid birds were dead, scattered all over the rocks. Once, now, from nearby, did father notice the wretchedness of that wasted generation, the nonsense of its second-rate anatomy. They had been nothing but enormous bunches of feathers stuffed carelessly with old carrion. In many of them one could not recognize where the heads had been, for that misshapen part of their bodies was unmarked by the presence of a soul. Some were covered with a curly matted fur, like bison, and stank horribly. Others reminded one of hunchbacked, bald, dead camels. Others still must have been made of a kind of cardboard, empty inside, but splendidly colored on the outside. Some of them proved, at close quarters, to be nothing more than large peacocks' tails, colorful fans, into which by some obscure process a semblance of life had been breathed. I saw my father's unhappy return. The artificial day became slowly tinted by the colors of an ordinary morning. In the deserted shop, the highest shelves were bathed in the reflections of the morning sky. Amid the fragments of the extinct landscape, among the ruined background of scenery of the night, father saw his shop assistants awakening from sleep. They rose from among the bales of cloth and yawned toward the sun. In the kitchen, on the floor above, Adela, warm from sleep and with unkempt hair, was grinding coffee in a mill, which she pressed to her white bosom, imparting her warmth to the broken beans. The cat was washing itself in the sunlight.